20,000 people vanished underground. They didn't run to the hills. They went down, into doorways no one could see from the valley and lived. For weeks, for months, sometimes for years, entire communities sheltered beneath their homes, huddled in carved rooms, moving livestock through narrow tunnels, rationing air and water while war and plague and raiding parties circled above. How do you design a city to become invisible and survive long enough that an entire population stops being a target and becomes a ghost? Think about that for a second. An ordinary village people baking bread, tending goats, arguing at market turns into a population that can disappear from sight, maintain hygiene, keep babies alive, deliver mail, hold church services, and still resist invasion. That's not a cave. That's urban engineering below ground. And what saved them wasn't luck. It was design that treated rock, breath, and geometry like tools. The place I'm talking about started as soft volcanic stone and ended up as an organized refuge. Tunnels, chambers, wells, ventilation shafts, stables, kitchens, churches, and security features that made thousands survivable in complete isolation. Over centuries, people refined the system. They learned how to hide entrances in plain view. They learned how to move smoke without giving themselves away. They learned how to keep water flowing when the world above was broken. The question is simple and brutal. What did they fear so much they were willing to live underground? And how did that underground city actually work? The short answer: invaders with swords and fire, and later armies with more destructive tools, drove the need. The long answer is engineering, social organization, and a kind of stubborn planning that treated survival like a municipal function. Imagine a summer morning. The bells at the hilltop church haven't rung yet, but there's a distant sound. Horses, a pack of voices, the first smoke of fires started where crops were meant to be. A child sees movement on the ridge and runs home. The women shove loaves into sacks. Men herd the goats through concealed openings at the back of cellars. People move with practiced efficiency because they've practiced this exact sequence for decades. There are no panic scenes. There is routine because routine is survival. This routine was built into the architecture. The rock these people lived under was tough, soft enough to carve with chisels but strong enough to stand in large chambers once shaped. The first revelation is simple. Geology made it possible, but geology alone is not architecture. These communities engineered systems that address three lethal problems: oxygen, water, and detection. Start with air. An enclosed underground population will suffocate if ventilation is poor. The builders solved this with vertical shafts drilled to the surface, dozens of them arranged like chimneys. Some shafts were simple, a narrow column of air running up through the rock. Others were engineered with branching channels and baffles, forcing air to circulate through living spaces before reaching the outside. Archaeologists today count more than 50 shafts in some complexes. Each shaft's diameter and depth were carefully tuned. Too wide and cold winter winds could flood the interior. Too narrow and the effective volume of breathable air would be limited. The shafts also doubled as waste management. Some drew stale air away from kitchens and latrines, using thermal differences between rooms to maintain a continuous flow. Then there's water. In times of siege, surface wells could be poisoned or blocked. The solution was to sink wells from the underground city itself to aquifers below wells that never touched the outside until water was drawn. These interior wells were often lined with smoothed stone and capped with heavy lids. Because they were deep, sometimes dozens of meters, they provided clean spring water even when the valley above was flooded with filth. The presence of an internal water source changed everything. It meant you could stay shut for weeks. It meant you could hydrate children and animals. It meant you could outlast a raiding season. Detection was the third problem. You can't let smoke or footsteps betray your location. So the builders developed protocols. Kitchens were clustered around smokeless hearths, with long smoke channels that dispersed exhaust to multiple shafts, diffusing the thermal signature that might betray a human presence. Entrances were small, often hidden under cellars or behind false walls, and frequently led through labyrinthine corridors designed to confuse outsiders. The corridors were narrow and deliberately low in parts, slowing the advance of an armed party and creating choke points where a few defenders could hold off many. Round stone doors 6 men could roll one into place, sealed off sections. They were shaped to be rolled into grooves and could only be opened from the inside. These doors doubled as locks and air buffers. Here's the part that still gets me. These weren't emergency caves you crawl into for a night. They were cities with functions. There were communal kitchens large enough to roast a sheep. There were dairies, wells, wine presses, and storage rooms for grain, sometimes enough to feed thousands for months. There were stables where small herds were kept. There were classrooms, chapels, and even health spaces where someone tended wounds and managed childbirth. One chamber sometimes served as a school in peacetime and an infirmary in crisis. The architecture allowed adaptation. A family room could be a guard post. A wine cellar could be a larder. People repurposed spaces as the need arose. How did governance work underground? That's another reveal. These communities had a chain of command that was part municipal, part religious. Elders, often priests, knew the drill books, who went where, who guarded which shaft, who kept the keys to the rolling stones. There's evidence that entry into the city was controlled by a registry list of names, ages, and useful skills. When the alarm sounded, people didn't flood in randomly. They had assigned stalls and bunks. They had rationing plans. Young men were tasked with guard duty at choke points. Women coordinated food distribution. It was detailed and grim because it had to be. Imagine keeping 15,000 people fed and sane underground for a month. You need rules, distribution chains, and, crucially, someone willing to enforce them. Now let's put the stakes into human terms. Consider a family we can name for the narrative, call them the Ardens. The Ardens had a small courtyard and a cellar. When raiders came 2 summers in a row, the Ardens and their neighbors were already half-packed. The mother, Zainab, put her newborn in a cloth sling and moved through a warren that only she and 2 other women used. They ducked into a vestibule barely wide enough for 3 people abreast. A child's bare feet slid on worn stone. The air smelled of preserved onions and burned animal fat. Zainab had never seen the city this full. In past raids, only certain families stayed. This time the whole valley came down. She could hear the sound of metal on metal above, armor, the ringing that meant doors were being broken. She had a choice: stay above and risk being captured, or go down and trust a plan older than the king. They went down. The first 24 hours underground were the hardest. People adjusted to dim light. Candles were rationed and shaded to prevent smoke from accumulating. Babies cried and were soothed by women who had already given birth in these chambers before. Someone started a prayer in a low voice, and gestures passed down corridors. Check the western shaft, close the 3rd stone, bring more grain to the central kitchen. The logistics are what kept panic from spreading. Skilled hands stitched wounds from the wounded who trickled in. An old potter had a stove converted into a small bakery. In 3 days, the city found its rhythm. Outside, the invaders burned fields, smashed stocks, and took what they could. Inside, the underground city conserved and persevered. Weeks passed. The invaders, impatient and unable to root out people who did not appear in any village census, moved on. Above ground, the valley was a ruin. Underground, an entire population had survived with loss, but with life intact. We need to break down the engineering details further, because the survival here wasn't accidental. The stones themselves rolled doors are a textbook lesson in low-tech resilience. A typical door in some of these complexes weighs between 1 and 2 tons. It sits in a groove and is circular, like a millstone. To roll it into place requires effort from inside, not outside. The groove prevents external leverage. Attackers who can smash a wooden door might find a single stone door immovable without heavy equipment. That buys you time, hours, and sometimes days. Acoustic design was another hidden advantage. Narrow corridors and right-angle turns prevent shouts from traveling straight. This meant you could move large numbers of people without announcing your path. If a scout from the invaders got in, he was likely to get lost and trapped. That aspect of spatial psychology, designing space to disorient intruders while guiding insiders, was intentional. The builders used human scale as a weapon, low ceilings to slow cavalry, tight turns to slow armored men, sudden openings to create traps or ambush points. The medical setups underground were basic but effective. They had supplies of herbs, poultices, even surgical tools preserved in waxed boxes. Midwives were valued for their skill in noisy, cramped conditions. Infectious disease was a constant threat. Poor sanitation in closed environments can spread illness fast. But the planners built separate waste shafts and isolated latrines away from living quarters, connected to sealed channels. They established quarantine protocols. Someone with fever was moved to an outer chamber with its own ventilation loop. That's an ancient public health measure. It saved lives. There are critical moments worth highlighting. One year, a region-wide epidemic made an entire valley desperate. The underground city wasn't designed for pandemics, but its systems reduced exposure dramatically. People who stayed above ground in villages died in higher numbers because caregivers and families continued contact. Underground, where entry was limited and movement controlled, there was a 40 to 60% reduction in transmission in contemporary analyses of similar shelters. It's counterintuitive. Being packed together reduces airflow, but the controlled ventilation and restricted external contact turned out to be life-saving compared to the chaos above. Another revelation: the population didn't just hide, they fought. The underground city was a staging ground for resistance. Ambushes were planned from hidden exits. Raiders who assumed the valley was empty walked straight into traps. The defenders used knowledge of the surface where quicksand lay, where the ridge concealed rockfalls, to coordinate counterattacks. They didn't always win battles, but they prolonged resistance long enough for rulers to send relief or for raiders to grow tired and move on. Let's talk about the cost. Living underground long-term leaves mental scars. Lack of sunlight affects mood and health. Vitamin D deficiency wasn't named back then, but people suffered its consequences. Fatigue, bone pain, slower healing. Prolonged confinement meant limited privacy and increased tension. There are accounts of interpersonal violence. Arguments over rationing ended badly. Children raised underground had different rhythms of life. They learned to navigate tunnels before they learned to read fields. The social structure changed. Elders who controlled access and distribution wielded enormous power. That's one reason why these cities left deep legacies in local politics for generations. Over time, the city adapted to peacetime. Rooms were repurposed into storage for surplus harvests. The underground network became semi-permanent infrastructure used for cold storage of perishable goods, for wine aging, for safekeeping of records. When threats returned, the transition back to shelter mode was shorter. Some populations developed multi-layered entrances, concealed doors in houses that led to the tunnels. A neighbor's cellar might be an access point for several families. The architecture blurred private and public space in ways modern planners rarely imagine. What happened to these underground cities in the long run? Many were gradually abandoned as political stability increased and centralized armies made long-term hiding unnecessary. Others were sealed by owners who feared looters. Some were rediscovered by accident. A farmer digging a cistern falls through into a cavern. When archaeologists began to explore these sites in the 20th century, they found layers of history: graffiti, oil lamps, carved Christian symbols, primitive insulation, and evidence of Syrian, Persian, Byzantine influences. The sites are time capsules, but they're also testament to a particular human choice: to engineer survival where none seemed possible. There are larger lessons here. First, survival can be municipal rather than individual. When threat is systemic, When entire valleys are at risk, solutions must be collective. The underground city succeeded because it was communal. Second, low-tech resilience matters. You don't need modern materials to design life-sustaining spaces. With stone, wood, and human coordination, communities solved problems we still struggle with in disaster planning: water security, air quality, sanitation, and concealed mobility. Third, design can be defensive and humane. The goal wasn't only to keep people alive. It was to keep societies intact: families, trades, rituals, and faith. That intent shaped every corridor and chimney. Think about our modern cities for a moment. We build for convenience: glass, open plazas, easy access. We plan evacuation routes for highways and stadiums. But few cities today have the cultural memory of sheltering an entire population for months underground. There's discipline required for that. Trust in elders, acceptance of rationing, a willingness to trade sunlight for survival. Those social muscles can atrophy. When disaster comes, improvisation is messy. The underground cities show us a different ethic: planning for the worst, normalizing the practice, and keeping skills alive. And then there's the human tenacity. Zeynep and her neighbors emerged after the raiders left. They climbed into a valley of charred beams and smoke-stained walls, collected what they could salvage, and rebuilt. The underground city remained. Sometimes they used it again. In the slow arc of history, these subterranean networks kept bloodlines and skills alive. They saved entire populations not by moving them to a safe country or a fortress paid for by a king, but by giving them a place to wait out catastrophe. This isn't a call to live underground now. It's a reminder that resilience is both technical and cultural. You can design ventilation shafts and rolling stone doors, and you should. But you also need a social plan. Who keeps the keys? How do you share bread? What rules prevent hoarding? The ancient engineers solved both problems in ways we can still learn from. There is one last thing that hits me every time I walk through those tunnels as a visitor. Yes, you can visit some of them today. Imagine standing in a room where an entire community once slept. The rock is cold under your hand. You can run your fingers along grooves carved by generations. You can see faint soot on the ceilings where hearths used to be, and you can imagine the pressure of thousands of decisions made in a single hour. It's a very human feeling: ingenuity under pressure. The underground city didn't promise comfort. It promised survival. It asked people to accept cramped spaces, to ration light, to trust one another's competence. In exchange, it offered life. So, what answers our opening question? How did an underground city save an entire population? By turning geology into infrastructure, by prioritizing air and water and secrecy, by creating governance that worked in the dark, and by teaching communities to move without panic. Those are engineering and social facts you can map, measure, and replicate. They are also moral choices. In the end, a network of tunnels is a statement. We will not accept extinction as the only option. If you believe stories like this matter, subscribe to Paradigm. Here, every story shifts perspective. Every truth demands attention.